Margaret Thompson had always dreamed of a quiet retirement after her husband's passing. She sought solace in the serene community of Maple Ridge, a picturesque neighborhood with manicured lawns, white picket fences, and an unspoken promise of peaceful living. The move was meant to be a fresh start, a place where she could tend her garden, enjoy the morning sun, and embrace the gentle rhythm of suburban life. Her grandson, Ethan, had been her rock throughout the transition, a determined young man in his late 20s. He had always admired his grandmother's resilience. He helped her settle in, ensuring she had everything she needed, from installing security cameras to stocking her pantry with her favorite teas. But nothing brought Margaret more comfort than Duke, the German shepherd she had adopted just a month prior. Duke wasn't just any dog. His sharp eyes and poised demeanor hinted at a disciplined past, though Margaret knew little of his history beyond the fact that he was a service animal. His loyalty was unmatched, and his presence made her feel safe. Neighbors would often admire Duke from a distance, though some seemed wary of his imposing frame. Still, Margaret was confident that he was nothing but a gentle soul. For a while, everything seemed perfect. Margaret fell into a comforting routine. Morning walks with Duke, afternoons tending to her flower beds, and evenings reading on her porch. She found joy in greeting her neighbors, exchanging pleasantries with Mrs. Calloway next door, and watching children play in the cul-de-sac. It was the life she had envisioned, but peace, as Margaret would soon learn, was an illusion carefully maintained by the iron grip of the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a crisp white envelope, slipped into her mailbox just 2 weeks after moving in. The letter bore the official HOA seal and a signature that would soon become all too familiar. Judith Carlisle, the HOA president. Notice of violation. Dear Mrs. Thompson, it has come to our attention that you have placed unapproved flower pots on your front porch, which do not conform to Maple Ridge's aesthetic guidelines. Additionally, we must remind you that Maple Ridge enforces a strict breed policy regarding pets, and your German Shepherd falls under the category of aggressive breeds. You are required to remove the dog from the premises immediately to remain in compliance. Failure to do so will result in escalating fines and potential legal action. Sincerely, Judith Carlisle, president of the Maple Ridge HOA. Margaret read the letter twice, then a third time, her hands trembling. Her flower pots? They were simple ceramic planters filled with marigolds, hardly an eyesore. And Duke? He had never shown aggression toward anyone. Frustration bubbled in her chest, but she took a deep breath, refusing to let intimidation get the better of her. Ethan arrived that evening to check on her, immediately noticing the tension in her expression. She handed him the letter, watching as his brow furrowed. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "They can't just demand you get rid of Duke." Margaret sighed. "They seem to think they can." Ethan tapped the paper against his palm, a determined look in his eyes. "I'll do some digging. These HOAs thrive on fear, but they're not untouchable." Despite Ethan's reassurances, the harassment escalated. Margaret found additional notices pinned to her door, each one citing new violations. Her mailbox was not HOA approved, her welcome mat was too large, and Duke's presence was a safety concern. Her peaceful mornings were soon disrupted by the disapproving glares of board members during their neighborhood patrols. Conversations with friendly neighbors grew hesitant, as if speaking to her too long might invite unwanted attention from the HOA. Then came the vandalism. One morning, Margaret stepped outside to find her flower pots shattered, soil strewn across her porch. Her mailbox, once upright, now lay dented on the pavement. She reported the incidents to the HOA, only to receive a dismissive response. "We have no evidence that this was done intentionally," Judith had said with a tight-lipped smile. Perhaps it was the wind. Margaret knew better, and so did Duke. The dog had begun to grow restless, sensing her unease. His protective instincts kicked in, his presence a silent warning to those who dared to push further. But Judith wasn't done. She wanted Margaret gone, and if intimidation didn't work, she had other means. Margaret, however, was not so easily broken. The next letter came with a fine, $500 for Duke's continued presence. Margaret read it twice, her jaw tightening. She wasn't made of money, and the HOA knew it. Ethan, upon hearing the news, was livid. This isn't about rules. They want to break you. Margaret nodded. Then we won't let them. She started documenting everything. Every note, every glare from Judith and her cronies, every whispered conversation that stopped when she walked by. And Duke. He watched too, his keen eyes tracking every movement on the street. One evening, Margaret heard rustling outside. She stepped onto her porch just in time to see a shadowy figure dart away, leaving behind another shattered flower pot. Her pulse quickened, but Duke was already on high alert, a low growl rumbling in his throat. Enough was enough. Margaret marched to the next HOA meeting, Ethan at her side. The moment she stepped into the community hall, conversation hushed. Judith sat at the front, her expression cool and composed. Margaret cleared her throat. I'd like to address the harassment I've been experiencing. Judith didn't blink. We enforce the rules equally, Mrs. Thompson. Then why are others allowed flower pots? Why am I the only one receiving vandalism? Judith smiled, an expression as false as the neighborhood's supposed harmony. Perhaps you should consider that some people find your dog intimidating. Ethan stepped forward. Duke is a trained service dog. He's never been aggressive. Judith shrugged. Regardless, Maple Ridge has policies. Margaret had expected this. She pulled out a copy of the neighborhood bylaws. There's nothing about breed bans in the official rule book. For the first time, Judith faltered. A murmur ran through the room. We can make amendments, she said stiffly. We have the authority. Margaret folded her arms. Then maybe we should discuss why the HOA funds show unexplained expenditures. A hush fell over the board. Judith's lips pressed together. Margaret had struck a nerve. And for the first time, she knew the battle was just beginning. Margaret's confrontation at the HOA meeting had done something she hadn't expected. It had shaken Judith Carlyle. Though the HOA president had tried to mask it with an air of indifference, Margaret had seen the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. Ethan, too, had caught the momentary falter, and he wasn't about to let it slide. But if Margaret and Ethan thought the HOA would back down, they were sorely mistaken. Instead, the retaliation came swiftly calculated and cruel. The very next morning, a tow truck rumbled down the quiet streets of Maple Ridge and stopped in front of Margaret's driveway. Confused, Margaret rushed outside just in time to see two men inspecting her car, one scribbling something on a clipboard. "Excuse me, what's going on?" she asked, her voice firm despite the dread creeping in. One of the men barely looked up. "Violation of HOA parking rules, ma'am. Your car is being towed." Margaret's breath caught. "That's impossible. I park in my own driveway." Ethan, who had been inside, stormed out as soon as he heard the commotion. "Hey, you can't just take her car." The man with the clipboard shrugged. "You'll have to take it up with the HOA, son." Margaret's fingers tightened into fists. She turned toward Judith's house, where the HOA president stood watching from her porch, arms crossed, a satisfied smirk playing on her lips. "Ethan," Margaret said through gritted teeth, "call the police." Ethan nodded and pulled out his phone. But before he could dial, the tow truck's driver snapped his fingers. "Ma'am, we're authorized by the HOA. You can pay the fine and get your car back in 3 days. Until then, it's impounded." Margaret felt helpless as the truck pulled away, her vehicle gone. Ethan, on the other hand, was seething. "They're trying to break you, Grandma. They want you to give up." Margaret exhaled slowly. "Then they don't know me very well." The attack on Duke. If taking Margaret's car was meant to discourage her, it had the opposite effect. She doubled down, making copies of the HOA bylaws and researching her rights as a homeowner. Ethan, meanwhile, began digging into Maple Ridge's financial records, looking for any inconsistencies in the HOA's expenditures. But while they focused on the legal battle, Judith and her loyalists took a more insidious route. One evening, as Margaret was watering her garden, Duke suddenly stiffened, his ears pricking forward. A low growl rumbled in his chest. Margaret turned just in time to see a figure hurl something over her fence before darting away into the night. Margaret hurried over, her stomach twisting. Lying on the ground was a raw piece of meat, and beside it, a white, Powdery substance dusted the edges. "Duke, no!" she shouted, lunging forward. Duke had already sniffed the meat, but his training kicked in, and he hesitated at her command. Margaret quickly scooped it up, careful not to touch the suspicious powder. Ethan arrived moments later, alarmed by her shouting. "What happened?" Margaret showed him the meat. "Someone tried to poison Duke." Ethan's face darkened. "That's attempted animal cruelty. We're reporting this." They took the meat straight to the local vet, who confirmed their worst fears. It was laced with rat poison. "That amount could have killed him," the vet said grimly. "If he had eaten it, he wouldn't have survived." Margaret clenched her fists. "They're trying to scare me. They think they can make me leave." Ethan shook his head. "No, Grandma. This is more than intimidation. This is an attack. The hidden truth." While Margaret was dealing with the assault on Duke, Ethan had made a breakthrough in his investigation. He pored over Maple Ridge's HOA financial records, comparing them to the official neighborhood expenses. The numbers didn't add up. The HOA was collecting significantly more in fees than what was being spent on community upkeep. There were vague entries labeled miscellaneous improvements, with thousands of dollars funneled into them. Money that had no paper trail. Ethan's heart pounded as he printed the documents. He had them now. Proof that something shady was happening in Maple Ridge. And he had a feeling Judith was right at the center of it. Armed with the records, he called Margaret. "We've got them," he said. "Judith has been siphoning money from the HOA. She's been bleeding the homeowners dry." Margaret exhaled sharply. "Then it's time to take this to the authorities." Ethan agreed, but before they could proceed, an urgent call came through from a neighbor. "Margaret," whispered Mrs. Calloway, her voice trembling, "I heard Judith talking to someone on the phone. She knows you're digging. She's planning something big." Margaret's grip tightened around the phone. "Did she say what?" "No," Mrs. Calloway admitted, "but she sounded desperate." Margaret and Ethan exchanged a look. They had cornered Judith. And when a person like her was backed into a corner, they lashed out. Margaret knew one thing for certain. The worst was yet to come. Margaret knew Judith wouldn't go down without a fight, but she hadn't expected the next attack to come so soon, or so viciously. It began with an official notice. A stark white envelope, slipped under her door in the dead of night. Inside, stamped with an urgent red seal, was an eviction notice, effective immediately. Due to continued violations and refusal to comply with HOA regulations, you are required to vacate your property within 30 days. Failure to do so will result in legal action. Margaret's hands trembled as she read it. Her heart pounded against her ribs, but she steadied herself. They were trying to scare her, to bully her into submission, but they had underestimated her resolve. Ethan, upon seeing the notice, clenched his jaw. "This isn't legal," he said. "They can't evict you like this." Margaret nodded. "Then let's make sure they know that." That afternoon, they went to the local courthouse, bringing the financial documents Ethan had uncovered. They spoke with an attorney, who was appalled by what he saw. "This is fraud," the lawyer said. "Your HOA is siphoning money, and they're abusing their power to cover it up." Ethan leaned forward. "Can we fight this eviction?" "Absolutely," the attorney replied. "But we need to expose them first." Margaret and Ethan knew that fighting the HOA through legal channels would take time. But they also knew that public pressure could be just as powerful. The next day, Ethan posted everything online, detailed breakdowns of the financial discrepancies, the fraudulent fines, and even the poison meat meant for Duke. The story exploded. People were outraged. Comments flooded in, condemning Judith and the Maple Ridge HOA. Local news stations picked up the story. A reporter even came to interview Margaret in her home. This community was supposed to be a safe place, Margaret said on camera, holding back the emotion in her voice. But they have harassed me, vandalized my home, and even tried to poison my dog. The reporter turned to Duke, who sat beside Margaret, stoic and alert. "And what do you say to the claim that your dog is dangerous?" Margaret smiled for the first time in days. "Duke is a hero." Ethan stepped in. "They tried to force my grandmother out because she wouldn't back down. But we have proof of their corruption, and we won't stop until justice is served. The news segment aired that evening, and the fallout was immediate. Neighbors who had been too afraid to speak up before now found their voices. More homeowners came forward with their own complaints, unjust fines, threats, and suspicious HOA fees. Judith had ruled through intimidation, but now she was losing control. That night, something shifted in the air. Margaret could feel it. Duke could too. At exactly 2 a.m., Duke jolted awake, ears perked. A low, guttural growl rumbled in his chest. Margaret sat up just as the motion sensor light in her backyard flicked on. A shadow moved along the fence line. Then the sound of a latch clicking. Someone was trying to get into her yard. Margaret didn't hesitate. She reached for her phone, dialing Ethan as she stepped toward the window. But Duke was already at the back door, his stance rigid, his teeth bared. The lock jiggled. Then the door swung open. A figure slipped inside. Duke moved like lightning, a blur of muscle and precision. He lunged, tackling the intruder to the ground. The man yelped in terror as Duke's teeth hovered just inches from his throat. Margaret flicked on the porch light, and there, pinned beneath Duke's massive paws, was one of Judith's most loyal enforcers, Paul, the HOA's so-called security officer. Ethan burst through the front door just as the police arrived. Paul stammered, struggling to come up with a lie. But the evidence was clear. He had broken into Margaret's home in the middle of the night, and thanks to Duke's training, he hadn't gotten. Paul's arrest sent shockwaves through Maple Ridge. With the public already turning against the HOA, this was a final straw. Under pressure, the board members began to crack. Some resigned immediately. Others turned on Judith, desperate to save themselves. And then the final blow came. Authorities launched a full-scale investigation into the HOA's financial records. What Ethan had uncovered was only the tip of the iceberg. Judith had been embezzling for years, using HOA funds to finance her lavish lifestyle. When officers arrived at her doorstep with an arrest warrant, she didn't even try to fight it. She knew she had lost. With Judith gone and the HOA dismantled, Margaret finally had her peace. The community, once ruled by fear, began to rebuild. Neighbors who had once kept their heads down now stood together, vowing to prevent another tyrant from taking control. As for Duke, he became a legend. The once misunderstood German shepherd had saved Margaret's life, and in doing so, he had saved the neighborhood too. Margaret stood on her porch, watching as Duke lounged in the sun. Ethan sat beside her, a triumphant smile on his face. "You did it, Grandma," he said. "You won." Margaret reached down, scratching Duke behind the ears. "We won," she corrected, "and we're not going anywhere." As the sun set over Maple Ridge, one thing was clear. Margaret had fought for her home, for her rights, and for justice. And she had won. With Judith Carlisle's arrest and the HOA's financial fraud exposed, the once feared Homeowners Association crumbled. The community of Maple Ridge, long oppressed under Judith's tyrannical rule, was now free. But freedom did not come without scars. Margaret stood on her front porch, surveying the neighborhood. The air felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. People who had once been afraid to speak out were now coming together, discussing ways to rebuild. For the first time in years, there was hope. Ethan sat beside her, laptop open, scanning through the news articles covering the downfall of the HOA. "Grandma, you've got to see this," he said, tilting the screen toward her. "They're calling it the HOA scandal that shocked the city." Margaret chuckled, shaking her head. "I never wanted to be famous," she said, sipping her tea. "I just wanted to be left in peace." Ethan grinned. "Well, you did more than that. You took down a corrupt HOA. You saved this neighborhood." Duke, ever vigilant, lay at Margaret's feet. The once misunderstood German shepherd was now a local hero. Kids in the neighborhood, once wary of him due to Judith's lies, now ran up to pet him whenever they passed by. Who would have thought, Margaret mused, stroking Duke's head, that the very dog they tried to ban would be the one to save us all. With the HOA dismantled, the residents face a new challenge, figuring out how to govern themselves. Many were eager to dissolve the association altogether, but others worried about maintenance and upkeep. A town hall meeting was held, this time not in fear, but in unity. Margaret, despite her initial reluctance, was asked to speak. She stepped forward, her voice steady. We all moved here because we want a community, a safe place to call home. But along the way, that sense of community was replaced with fear. That ends today. We have a chance to build something better. Applause erupted. Suggestions flowed. Instead of an authoritarian HOA, the residents voted for a voluntary neighborhood committee, one that would focus solely on maintenance and safety, with full transparency. Margaret, to her surprise, was nominated as an honorary advisor. She laughed, shaking her head. I think I've had enough HOA drama for one lifetime, she said, but I'll always be here to help. Ethan nudged her. You're a legend now, Grandma. You can't just retire. Margaret rolled her eyes. I think I've earned the right to sit on my porch and enjoy my tea. Judith's fate. While Maple Ridge moved on, Judith Carlisle faced a very different future. The investigation into her finances uncovered years of embezzlement, fraud, and misappropriation of HOA funds. Former board members testified against her, desperate to save themselves. In the end, Judith was sentenced to several years in prison. Her fall from power was complete. Ethan found himself watching the courtroom footage one evening, seeing Judith's once arrogant demeanor replaced with exhaustion. She really thought she was untouchable, he said, shaking his head. Margaret, ever wise, simply said, power built on fear always crumbles in the end. Before Judith was taken away, Margaret received an unexpected request, a visit. Against Ethan's protests, she agreed. The meeting took place in a small holding room at the county jail. Judith, in an orange jumpsuit, sat across from her, no longer the immovable force she once was. You won, Judith said, her voice hollow. Margaret met her gaze without flinching. No, Judith, the community won. For the first time, Judith looked tired. I built this neighborhood, she muttered. I kept it running. Margaret shook her head. You built a kingdom of fear. And it fell the moment people stood together. Judith exhaled slowly. I never thought you'd fight back. Margaret leaned forward. That was your mistake. For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then Judith looked away. I have nothing left, she admitted. Margaret studied her, feeling neither pity nor triumph. Then, maybe it's time you think about why. And with that, she stood and left, never looking back. Months passed, and Maple Ridge flourished. Without Judith's oppression, the neighborhood transformed. Gardens bloomed, fences were painted, and the air buzzed with life. It was no longer a place of rules and punishments. It was a true community. Margaret finally felt at home again. One evening, as she rocked on her porch, Ethan sat beside her, watching the sunset. So, what's next for you, Grandma? He asked. Margaret smiled, looking at Duke, who lay at her feet, his eyes half closed in contentment. I think I'll just enjoy the quiet, she said. For once, I don't have to fight. Ethan chuckled. Until the next HOA tries something. Margaret laughed. Then they'd better be ready. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Margaret felt a deep sense of peace. She had stood her ground. She had fought for her home. And now, at long last, she could simply live. Duke let out a satisfied sigh, as if he, too, knew that the battle was over. And together, they watched as Maple Ridge became a neighborhood it was always meant to be. Months had passed since Judith Carlisle's downfall, yet the echoes of her reign still linger in the minds of Maple Ridge's residents. Though the HOA was officially disbanded, the scars of its oppressive rule were not so easily erased. Some homeowners struggle with the idea of self-governance, unsure of how to move forward without an authority dictating every aspect of their lives. Others embrace the newfound freedom, eager to take ownership of their community in a way they never had before. Margaret, though reluctant to step into any official role, found herself naturally assuming the position of a community elder. Neighbors often came to her for advice, not because she held power, but because she had proven time and time again that she would always stand up for what was right. She had become the heart of Maple Ridge, a guiding force for those still finding their way. Ethan, too, had changed. The battle with the HOA had taught him the power of persistence and the importance of standing firm against injustice. He had once dreamed of leaving Maple Ridge behind, of escaping the quiet suburban life for something bigger. But now, he saw value in what his grandmother had fought for. He started organizing community events, encouraging neighbors to rebuild the trust that had been shattered by years of fear. Duke, ever the loyal protector, had become a symbol of resilience. What was once a dog seen as a nuisance by the HOA was now a beloved figure in the neighborhood. Families who had been afraid to let their children near him now welcomed his presence. He was no longer just Margaret's guardian. He was the community's guardian, a silent testament to the power of second chances. One evening, as Margaret sat on her porch sipping tea, she watched as a group of children ran past, their laughter filling the air. The neighborhood was alive again. It had taken time, but the wounds were healing. Ethan sat beside her, looking at the sunset. "You ever think about how close we were to losing all of this?" he asked. Margaret nodded. "Every day. And that's why we have to remember." Ethan smiled. "Well, I think the neighborhood is doing a pretty good job of that. They still talk about you like you're some kind of legend." Margaret chuckled. "I'm just an old woman who wanted some peace." Ethan shook his head. "No, Grandma. You're the woman who taught an entire neighborhood how to fight back." As the last light of the sun dipped below the horizon, Margaret felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Maple Ridge had been through a storm, but it had come out stronger. And as long as the people remembered the power they held, they would never allow another Judith Carlisle to rise again. The months that followed Judith Carlisle's downfall were a season of change for Maple Ridge. Without the HOA's heavy-handed oversight, the neighborhood began to evolve. The rigid conformity that once defined it gave way to individuality and self-expression. Yards flourished with gardens once deemed unapproved vegetation. Porches were adorned with colorful decorations, and laughter became the dominant sound on the streets rather than whispered fear. Margaret, who had once been the most targeted resident under Judith's reign, now found herself as an unwitting matriarch of the neighborhood. Her wisdom and defiance had inspired many, and though she had no interest in leadership, people continued to seek her guidance. One evening, as she rocked in her chair, Duke lay at her feet, Ethan joined her with a satisfied sigh. "Grandma, you know they're talking about making a new neighborhood council? One that actually listens to people instead of bullying them." Margaret smirked. "That's what they should have been doing all along." Ethan nodded. "They want you to be part of it." Margaret scoffed. "I've had my fill of fighting. Let someone else handle the meetings and decisions." Ethan chuckled. "Yeah, but they trust you. People want to make sure no one like Judith ever rises again." Margaret considered this, glancing out at the street where children played freely, no longer afraid of being reported for disturbing the peace. Before she could answer, a car pulled up. A woman stepped out, one of the newer residents, Amelia Torres. She had moved in right before Judith's downfall and had been one of the first to embrace the neighborhood's new direction. Margaret, Ethan, Amelia greeted with a smile. "I just came to say thank you again. If it weren't for you two, I don't think we'd have the neighborhood we do now." Margaret waved her off. "It wasn't just us. It was all of us standing together." Amelia nodded. "Still, you showed us how to fight back." Ethan smirked. "Grandma does have a way of making people stand up for themselves." Margaret sighed, but a small smile tugged at her lips. "Well, if that's my legacy, I suppose I can live with it." Amelia beamed. "That's why we want you to cut the ribbon at the new community garden opening next week." Margaret blinked. "Community garden?" Ethan grinned. "Yeah, the old HOA lot where Judith used to hold her compliance meetings. They're turning it into something actually useful." Margaret chuckled. "Now that's a change I can get behind." Amelia left with a wave, and Margaret sat back, considering everything that had happened. There was no going back to the old ways, no return to a time before the HOA's rise. But maybe that was for the best. Maple Ridge had learned a hard lesson, and now it was finally free to grow into something better. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan glanced at her. "So, are you enjoying the new council?" Margaret sighed dramatically. "I suppose someone has to keep them in check." Ethan laughed, and Duke let out a satisfied huff. The battle was over, But the future was just beginning. The grand opening of the Maple Ridge Community Garden was more than just a ribbon-cutting ceremony. It was a declaration that the neighborhood had reclaimed its soul. The plot of land that once symbolized strict control now bloomed with vibrant flowers, lush vegetables, and benches where residents could sit and enjoy the fresh air. Children ran between the garden beds, and laughter, real, unguarded laughter, filled the air. Margaret stood at the front, a pair of large ceremonial scissors in her hands. Ethan stood beside her, grinning as he watched her take a deep breath. "Go on, Grandma," he encouraged. "You earned this." She smirked, rolling her eyes. "Didn't think I'd end up doing this in my golden years." The crowd cheered as she snipped the ribbon, officially opening the garden. It was a symbolic moment, one that represented everything they had fought for. The community had come together, rejected fear, and built something beautiful in its place. As people spread out, admiring the new space, Amelia Torres approached Margaret once more. "You know, this all started because you wouldn't let Judith push you around." Margaret chuckled. It started because she didn't know who she was messing with. They both laughed before Amelia's expression turned serious. "We really would love for you to stay involved in the new community board." Margaret shook her head with a smile. "I've done my part. It's time for the next generation to step up." Ethan crossed his arms. "You sure? You love telling people what to do." Margaret swatted at him playfully. "I'll be keeping an eye on things. But I think I'd rather spend my time gardening than dealing with more meetings." Duke let out a contented sigh at her feet, as if in agreement. The evening ended with a sense of peace Margaret hadn't felt in years. As she walked back home, Ethan at her side, she took in the sight of Maple Ridge, no longer a place of control and fear, but a true community. Her battle had been won, not just against Judith, but against the idea that power should be wielded through intimidation rather than unity. As they reached the porch, Ethan turned to her. "So what now?" Margaret smiled. Now I just live." For the first time in a long time, that was enough.